Good morning everybody. I'd like to add my welcome to you all for this two-day TSUM workshop. My name is Peter Jones. I'm Professor of Transport and Sustainable Development at University College London, and what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is introduce to you the aspects of the workshop concerned with alternative futures. This is very much about visioning the sort of city that you would like in the future, and as a background to that I'd like to give you some thoughts about how other cities have approached this in the past. Many cities have grappled with the idea of developing mobility visions over a long period of time, often stimulated by the experience of a rapid growth in car ownership associated with GDP, people moving to the cities, and so on. And cities have responded to that in different ways. Many cities have first of all tried to adapt to the car by accommodating the car as much as possible, by providing more roads, by providing more parking spaces, and in the process taking away space from people in their moving and also markets and so on. Many cities have followed this path, but others either decided to take a different path or after a period of time decided that actually trying to adapt the city to the car was not very successful. There were still high levels of congestion and pollution, but at the same time life for ordinary people was becoming more difficult. Other cities have gone directly to taking a different approach to actually try and limit the impacts of the car on the city, to limit the provision of parking spaces and road space, and promote sustainable mobility, and to prioritize high quality public streets and spaces where people can easily move around on foot and by cycle, and also be able to take part in activities with their neighbours or going to markets and so on. So there are different ways in which cities can plan their future to accommodate different types of mobility. Cities can build themselves around the car, or they can design the city for people and places, recognizing that the car has an important role, but that it has a limited role, and where possible, we should encourage active, healthy mobility and sustainable use of public transport. The question is, what sort of future would you like for Maputo, for you and for your children? And in the next few slides, I'll talk in a little bit more detail about this. So we've been involved in a project called Create, where we've looked at several European cities and how they've developed over the last 50 or 60 years. And in Europe, but also in North America and elsewhere, we can see three different policy perspectives that have shaped the way we think about our cities and the role of transport. One is what we call the car-oriented city, where car ownership and car use are growing rapidly. The public and politicians feel this is the future, and therefore they try and adapt the city to the car by building more roads, providing more parking spaces, and maybe decentralizing activities to try and reduce congestion. Another perspective is around the sustainable mobility city, where the idea is that you can use the space more efficiently and sustainably if you encourage people to use public transport of various types, also to walk and cycle for shorter journeys. And there's a third perspective that often overlays on that, and that's the idea of a city of places, recognizing that people come to cities, live and work in cities because of economic, social and cultural exchange, and therefore we want to make our cities as functional and as attractive as possible. So in the slide you can see on the screen at the moment, we've contrasted two cities that have taken rather different visions in their development. One that has gone for a car-based solution, where you can see here we've got Houston in the United States, where they're very large freeways and housing and development tends to be at relatively low density. Contrasting that with Barcelona in Spain, where the focus has been on sustainable mobility, livability, a city of places at higher density. And obviously African cities are different, but as an example you can see Maputo, which has some elements of both. And what does that translate to in terms of how people get around? Well, if you look at this slide here, you can see that in Houston we're talking around over 95% of trips actually being made by car, either by car driver or car passenger. Whereas when we look at Barcelona, we see car use goes down to only 18%, that public transport's 35%, and walking and cycling is about 46%. So huge differences in the way we get around and the sort of living experiences. And just for example there, again, Maputo, we can see has characteristics much closer to that of Barcelona. This slide looks a little complicated, but let me explain to you what's going on here. So on the graph here, on the vertical axis for each of the cities represented, we have an indication of the proportion of all the trips made by residents in that city in some form of motorised mode. So either car driver, car passenger, or motorcycle driver or motorcycle passenger. Along the bottom here, we don't have a time period, but we have the relative wealth of each of those cities in terms of GDP per capita. At one point in time, this actually is 1995. And when we plot 100 cities around the world based on their GDP and the proportion of trips made in a motorised mode, you can see there are very clearly two different patterns. There's a pattern where cities of increasing wealth actually become more and more car dominant and car dependent. So places like Houston having 95% of all their trips made by residents as a car driver and car passenger. On the other hand, we can see a series of cities, particularly in Europe, where the use of cars peaks at around 50%. And you can actually see at that point in time, the wealthier cities were actually experiencing lower levels of car use and higher proportion of trips made on foot, by cycle or by public transport. So we can see in effect that cities have adopted two different visions. One is their development very much around the car, and we see these tend to be lower density cities and so on, or cities that have decided to reduce or limit levels of car use and actually encourage mobility around walking, cycling and public transport, and built around a city of places. So there's less dominance of traffic, less dominance of roads, and economies where people can work, shop, visit friends and so on, easily, but without the dominance of the car. So how do these two different curves translate in practice? Well, on the left-hand side we have Atlanta, which represents one of the cities that was on the higher curve, that is very heavily car-oriented, and you can see there that there's a high proportion of space given over to high-capacity roads, parking spaces, and apart from the very centre of Atlanta, quite low-density living. On the other side we have Barcelona here, which represents one of the cities on the lower curve with relatively low levels of car use, although high levels of wealth, but a lot of green space and the ability to make local journeys on foot or by cycle. And we can see the consequences of that in terms of road safety, for example. So if we look at total traffic accidents, we can see in Atlanta in 2016, there were nearly 61,000 accidents of various types on the road network, whereas in Barcelona, that was less than 9,500. In terms of fatalities, we have 129 in that year in Atlanta and only 12 in Barcelona. But in terms of intermediate injuries, we have nearly 13,000 in Atlanta and only 250 in Barcelona. When we look at the area taken up by those two cities, we can see that at the same scale, the amount of space taken up by Barcelona is only a fraction of the amount of space taken up by Atlanta, because the density is much higher. We can see though the population is fairly similar, 2.5 million in Atlanta, 2.8 million in Barcelona, and as the map shows, effectively the size of Atlanta is nearly 4,300 square kilometres, whereas the equivalent size for Barcelona is only 662 square kilometres. And not only does it have implications in terms of road safety, but also if we look at CO2, for example, where we can see that in terms of all the different modes of transport taken together, on average we're talking about 7.5 emission tonnes per person in CO2, whereas in Barcelona we're talking about around 10% of that. The next couple of slides show other cities that at different points have had a car-based vision or sustainable mobility and place-based vision. And we can see for the same areas what a difference it makes. So for example in Rio de Janeiro, when they had a focus on trying to provide for cars, you can see they had expressway there and dominated by roads, very difficult to access this space in the centre of the city. Later in time, they decided to go for a place-based and mobility-based vision, and you can see that now becomes an important public space in the heart of the city, next to the waterfront. At a more local level, we can see in Bucharest, here's a street in the city centre, that originally they tried to provide for as much car use as possible, traffic passing through, particularly parking cars, and then more recently they've taken out the cars and decided they want to focus, their vision now is about being place-based and encouraging sustainable mobility. When cities have tried to adapt for the car, or all cities to some extent obviously have to allow for car use, then we tend to find all sorts of side effects. So for example, Amar Jordan, we get very, very heavy levels of congestion, but at that point very little alternatives for people. There's only poor public transport, there's not really adequate provision for walking or cycling. Or in Cairo, we can see here lots of parking and lots of confusion. In Bucharest, outside the parliament, then there's a lot of space for parking, which rather takes away from the impressive nature of that building. And then obviously air pollution we're aware of all around the world, but particularly in African cities. We see in Lagos, for example, the effects there of pollution, and worldwide around 7 million people die, it's estimated, in 2012 from air pollution. And then in addition to the visible air pollution, then we have CO2 emissions as well, and in the EU it's estimated that around 40% of carbon emissions in cities is a result of urban traffic. One of the things that comes up a lot with cities that are facing very rapid growth in car ownership is a growing concern about congestion. And mayors and people are always saying, well, how do we cope with congestion? I think there are several answers to that we've learnt from the CREATE project. First of all, in a way, congestion is a sign of success. If you go to a town or city where the industry's declined and the city is not doing well, you tend to find not so much traffic. So in a way, it's a barometer of success that you do have a certain degree of congestion. Although it might be tempting to talk about building one way out of congestion by providing more high capacity roads, that might work between cities but just doesn't work in cities, because there's so much potential demand drive that the experience is that even if you put lots of money into major road building, you still don't solve congestion. So in North America, even the car-based cities experience quite high levels of congestion. Some cities have tried to deal with this by regulation, particularly by pricing. So for example, London has a city centre congestion charge, Singapore has a wider area congestion charge that's more sophisticated, and in that way cities have been able to limit the levels of congestion. But other cities have adopted other methods. So generally the way to deal with congestion is to reduce the need to travel by car, and also to improve public transport. And as more people use public transport or walk and cycle, what happens is some of that road space and capacity is given over to these sustainable modes. And although people who still want or need to drive may be caught up in some congestion, most people actually avoid the congestion. And therefore in a place-based sustainable city, congestion affects a decreasing proportion of traffic, and other people can often travel more freely through bus lanes, tram lanes, BRT lanes, cycle lanes and so on. Just returning to the question about CO2, this is something obviously that's become increasingly important over the last months and years, and many cities now are declaring climate emergencies. We can see a number of cities around the world and look at the relationship or inverse relationship between the share of journeys made by public transport, walking and cycling, and the CO2 emissions per capita per year. So you can see in somewhere like Hong Kong, where 84% of all trips made by residents are on foot, cycle or by various forms of public transport, then we're talking about 378 kilogram per person. At the other extreme in Houston, where only 5% of trips are made by sustainable modes, we end up with nearly 5,700 kilogram per person. And we can see that quite strong inverse relationship between sustainability in terms of travel patterns and levels of carbon. And in fact, cities like London have their own vision for the future, where they want to have a city with very low or zero net levels of carbon, with clean air, with easy access and equitable transport systems. And so as part of that, we can see here that the Mayor's Transport Strategy, which goes out to 2041, has said a very key component of doing that is to reduce the amount of car use in London. So we look at 2014, these are trips made by residents in London, then car is 32%, taxi roughly is 1%, motorcycle 1%. So something like 34% of trips made by residents are in a sort of private motorised mode. Jump forward to 2041 and the ambition there is to reduce that down to only 20% of trips. So 80% of trips are made by various forms of public transport, walking or cycling. And in that way the city will achieve its other objectives of becoming more sustainable, more livable and a more pleasant environment in which people can live, work and organise their daily lives. So I hope that's helped. That's really what I wanted to say, give you some ideas about what the thinking has been in other parts of the world when cities have faced the challenges you're facing now, and to give you some thoughts as you start thinking about your own vision for the future of Freetown. Thank you very much.